Hi, Cornerstone Connection Group leaders. We are studying Romans, back to Romans this week at during the sermon time, and it's Jeff who's going to bring you the first half of Romans 8. And the first half of Romans 8 really builds a lot on what we did at the end of chapter 7, and builds on this theme that Troy, I think, hit really well. That the war is won, but the battle goes on. And let's remember the big point of Romans. In Romans, Paul wants to show how the gospel unveils or makes available to everyone the righteousness of God. Romans 1:17, one of the key verses in the book, says, for in the gospel, God's righteousness is revealed from faith to faith. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith, or the righteous will gain life through faith. So it says, for in it God's righteousness is revealed, it's unveiled, it's laid bare, it's made available for all. And that's really the main theme of Romans. And in Romans 8, we're still getting the good news, if you can believe that. We're still getting the good news. And the good news is, not only are we forgiven or justified or not condemned, we also now are going to live life under a whole new paradigm. We now live in the Spirit and not in the flesh. And that turns out to be a hard adjustment for many people to believe and understand. Not only are we forgiven because of what Jesus did in the flesh, our whole life is changed. We live in a completely different way, and that's a fact that Paul explains to us here. I want you to look at it this way. The Jews were working under the idea that the law could lead them to righteousness, that they could attain righteousness through the law. Paul explained to them that that was wrong. Paul says here that God did what the law couldn't do. It's one of the key verses in the first part of Romans 8. Verse 3 says, what the law could not do, since it was limited by the flesh, God did. Jesus came in the flesh to condemn sin in the flesh. Two key ideas here in the first part of Romans 8. Okay, two key ideas are, one, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ. And two, those who are in Christ live in the Spirit, not in the flesh. Now, Paul is telling us, in a sense, to try to live in the Spirit. But really, he's trying to tell you that if you are a Christian, you have changed and you're no longer living in or condemned by your flesh. You are alive in the Spirit. And he's encouraging us to live according to that knowledge. Verse 9 says, you, however, are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God lives in you. So if you've escaped condemnation, the Spirit of God lives in you. You are not saved from condemnation and then left exactly the same as you were before you were saved. You're saved from condemnation, and now you're living a whole new life in the Spirit. It's tied up in that notion of what Jesus says about being born again. You're living a new life, and this life is different. It's not in the flesh, it's in the Spirit. These ideas that we see here relate pretty well to some things that Bob Thune said this weekend at the Connection Group Leaders Training that we had, which I thought was awesome. Some of the things he said, I hope, can characterize some of our small group interactions this week. Let's kind of tie these two ideas together. What I think Romans 8 is saying, or the first part of Romans 8, and then some of the things that Bob Thune said. We no longer avoid sin because it condemns us. We worship God because he saved us. Bob's not God, but Bob Thune encouraged us not to make the focus sinning less, but rather to make the focus worshiping God more. As we worship God more, we will sin less. But the focus is on the worship of an awesome God and not on avoiding sin so that we don't go to hell. And part of these ideas are wrapped up in this notion of now we're alive in the Spirit and no longer alive in the flesh. We're dead to the flesh. We have a new life. And that new life is different. It's not just a life that's not condemned. It's not just a life that's forgiven, but it's a life that's new and it's different. And it involves the Spirit of God living inside of you. Here's some things that I think you might use as discussion points. Number one, I think a good exercise can be to look at some different life situations and life challenges and hypothetical ones and ask, Now, how would someone who's not under condemnation and someone who lives in the Spirit, how would they see or respond to this situation or challenge? And then likewise, how would someone who is still under condemnation and lives in the flesh, how would they see or respond to the situation or challenge? And then lastly, of course, how should I see or respond to the situation or challenge? So look at life situations and life challenges and compare and contrast what the difference would be as to how you would see that situation, that challenge, depending on if you're not under condemnation and living in the Spirit or under condemnation and living in the flesh. And then ask yourself, so how do I see that? Because one of these things is true if you're a believer. You're not under condemnation and you're alive in the Spirit. Another question to ask, I think, is what are some of the things that make it hard for you to believe that your life is not in the flesh now, that your life is no longer in the flesh, but it's now in the Spirit? And thirdly, how does it change your view of sin to know that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ and that the Spirit of God lives in you? How do those things change your view of sin? Romans 8 is awesome, and this first 11 verses that Jeff's going to cover this week are going to be a great encouragement and a challenge to you. And the encouragement is to know that these new things are true. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ, and the Spirit of God lives in you. And the challenge is to realign your life to live according to that truth. And those are truths that don't necessarily seem true to us at times. There's things that our senses sometimes lie to us about that. We feel like we're alive in the flesh. And Paul's telling us things that are true. And one of the things he's telling us true is that we are now alive in the Spirit, that our life is new. And he encourages us to live that new life. So talk through what that new life looks like in your connection group. And I know you're going to be encouraged by Jeff's coverage of Romans 8, 1 through 11.